Hello and welcome to Beyond 6 Seconds. I'm your host, Carolyn, and today I'm really happy to be here with my guest, Eric Garcia. He's a journalist based in Washington, D.C., and the senior Washington correspondent for The Independent. Previously, he was an assistant editor at the Washington Post's Outlook section, an associate editor at The Hill, and a correspondent for National Journal, Market Watch, and Roll Call. He has also written for The Daily Beast, The New Republic, and Salon.com. Eric is the author of the book, We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation, which was published in 2021. Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to interview you. I have the audio version of your book and I've listened to it twice, and it's just really just such a great work. And I'm excited to share it with my audience and learn more about your process for writing it.
You know, like recording an audiobook is such a surreal experience. Like, because the mics are so hot, you can't move at all. Otherwise, the mics will like pick up your movement, and like you had to eat when you're hungry because the mics would pick up your stomach growling, and like you had to constantly be drinking water, otherwise you get dehydrated.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like all of these things. And then like when I would come home, I wouldn't speak.
Mm-hmm.
It was all of these extra steps that you had to take to record it. So yeah, so I appreciate you listening to the audio version.
Yeah, I didn't realize how hot the mics were. And it's true, even though, I do an interview podcast, so I don't do most of the talking, but even if I have to record like a 5-minute bit, after all, I'm like, oh, my voice is tired and I feel like my mouth is dry. And it's like all these things, and I'm a singer, so I should be trained with the breath support, but it's hard to talk. And I can't imagine, how long were those recording sessions when you had to do that?
So I did them for like 3 days in a row. And they would go from like 9 a.m. to like 3 p.m. a day.
Wow.
So yeah, they were like 6-hour days.
Yeah, that's intense. Yeah,
yeah, it was intense.
Yeah, well, it's really great, and I've listened to it twice, so I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, as an accomplished journalist, you've been a journalist for your whole career, but you didn't start out writing about autism. So what inspired you to start writing about autism?
No, I didn't really want to write about autism at all. I wanted to write about economic policy and politics. I was perfectly happy. I was working at National Journal at the time. I was happy covering econ policy, politics. I was really early in my career, and that was around the time when if you covered finance or you covered banking, any event in Washington, you'd inevitably run into Elizabeth Warren. And anytime you covered anything about organized labor, you'd inevitably run into Bernie Sanders. So like, oddly enough, because I was a junior in my career, and because like the more senior people were covering Hillary Clinton, I wound up covering Warren and Sanders a lot. And this was like in 2015, and I was perfectly content to do that. Then I was 24 at the time, and a friend of mine offered me a drink, and I said, oh, I can't drink because I'm on the autism spectrum, and the medicine I take doesn't mix with alcohol. And instead of saying, oh, come on, have a drink, he was like, oh, that's interesting. The guy by the name of Tim Mack, he's now at NPR. He just wrote a great book about the history of the NRA called Misfire. I just need to plug that book because it's a great book. I recommend people read it. He was like, you should write something about that because there's a lot of autistic people in Washington. And then he pushed on me again later. And then I was just like, when I get good at my job, when I get better, I was new in my career. I didn't want to be labeled that guy. In fact, I'd argue that I spent a lot of time trying not to be seen as, the autism reporter or the autism guy. I tried to not let people know when I was in college or early in my career. And then what happened was National Journal, the print magazine, was going to close down at the end of the year. This is in 2015. So I wrote mostly for the website, but the print editor, a guy by the name of Richard Just, one lovely person, he said, pitch me ideas because I'm going to be out of a job at the end of the year. So like, what are they going to do? Fire me? Right. And so I pitched this idea to him about like, what's it like to be autistic in Washington, D.C. And he's like, that's all right. And, I thought it would be like a really fun kind of chatty piece, kind of like, front of the book kind of piece. And then he thought we could do better. He's like, why should this piece exist? And I said, well, I think we spend too much time trying to cure autism and not enough trying to ensure that autistic people live fulfilling lives. He's like, there's your piece, go. And around that time, it was a really interesting time when it came to autism, because if you remember, this was in 2015. This was when Donald Trump was running for president. When I should say, this was around the time that to be clear, this was around the time when Donald Trump was seen as a serious candidate for president of the United States, when he was no longer seen, like, I think when he first was announced, there was like, Donald Trump running for president, you know?
When he went down the stairs or the
But then like he started leading in the polls. And then I remember one debate, Jake Tapper asked him about his old tweets about vaccines and autism. And of course, Trump being Trump, he didn't back down. And he said, autism has become an epidemic. He said that autism is, he talked about the vaccines, and he talked about, a friend of his who had a, beautiful baby who, got, a vaccine, that looked like it was meant for a horse, and then, got a tremendous fever, and then the next day was autistic or something. And, Trump is Trump. So I wrote that piece, and it blew up, obviously. And then my friend of mine introduced me to his agent, and she said, "Do you want to do a book on this?" But I think the thing that was interesting was that I probably would have sold more books if I'd said, oh, look at, Donald Trump as a conspiracy theorist or things like that, or if I focused more on Trump. But the thing about it with Trump is that, yes, he's a habitual liar, but he doesn't pull these things out of thin air.
right.
There is a cycle that happens where it ultimately ends up, on Donald Trump's Twitter feed before he got his Twitter feed taken away. So that said to me that he's a conspiracy theorist, and how did these conspiracy theories foment on the right? And then also I grew up in Southern California, and I know plenty of, liberal hippy dippy people who believe that vaccines cause autism because of the toxins,
Right.
I know Los Angeles and like Long Beach and that kind of scene. But underlying it, what I realized was that underneath the vaccine autism lies and mistruths and myths, there is a fundamental argument, which is that it is better. There's this argument that it is better for your kids to get measles and die than it is for your children to be autistic. That's the underlying argument of anti-vaxxers.
Right.
And that really kind of, so I wrote that piece. And then I think the question was, okay, well, what if we stopped trying to cure autistic people? And what would it look like if we actually tried to build a better world for autistic people? So that led me to kind of hit the road. And so I went to Nashville, Tennessee. I went to Michigan. I went to West Virginia. I went to the Bay Area of California. I went to Pittsburgh. I spent a lot of time in Washington, which is where I live. And, I kind of decided to look like, what are the social gaps that exist for autistic people? But more important than that, what would it look like if we built a world for autistic people? And I think that is the underlying question that I set out to explore writing this book.
Yeah, and your book really tells that a very robust story about, really about how the public discourse about autism evolved over time, over the past, I don't know, century, I guess close to a century now at this point. You've got historical context, political, sociological, and you really touch on all these different areas. How did you pick the topics to cover in your book? Because you really cover a broad swath.
A lot of them I knew I wanted to do from the beginning. Like I wanted to do something on work, and I wanted to do something on, I think what I really wanted to do is I wanted to address, and this is more of the work of my agent, Heather Jackson. She said, like, why don't you pick some things where they're the most common myths and then look at how those myths cause harm. And I think that was a really productive way. So I have to credit my agent with that, Heather Jackson. And it was interesting because initially I didn't want to do a chapter on relationships because I didn't think it was really political. But then, that wound up, I think, being one of the best things I've ever written. Don't cheat and go into that chapter, read all this stuff before, I've told all your listeners, but like, but like on top of that, I think what I wanted to do is, I think, I'm a political reporter at heart. And that's what I do, and I've covered economics in the past. So I think what I looked at was, the state of the autistic union, so to speak, is determined not oftentimes by anything that disabled people or autistic people do. Oftentimes, it's a consequence of policy. So I think what it was really easy for me to do was it was easier for me to look at this is the outgrowth of this of X policy, or this is the outgrowth of this bad idea about autism. So for example, I think when I read about it in my chapter about work, there is this idea that autistic people can't find work, or if they can only find they'll only be able to find work in places like Silicon Valley or in STEM subjects. So what it did is I wanted to find out is that, like, I think that was a really just easy thing for me to do, was like, well, I know a lot of autistic people live in poverty, and I know that we don't really know the real unemployment rate for autistic people. And at the same time, there's almost kind of this bifurcation of autistic people where you have a lot of autistic people at the top who are working in Silicon Valley and Palo Alto, and it's not just, I just say, not just in tech. A lot of them work in finance. A lot of them work for like EY or UBS or a lot of financial companies. Like, in hindsight, I covered a lot of high frequency traders early in my career, and I'm convinced that like about half of a lot of the people who are involved in high frequency trading are probably on the autism spectrum or something like that. I'm not a scientist, that would be irresponsible for me to do, but like in hindsight, like later on when I was writing about it, I was like, oh wait, a lot of them would just, like, when I would talk to them on the phone reporting, they would like talk my ear off for 30 minutes and I wouldn't get a single question in. So like that was just but then on top of that, like there's this priority to really hire a lot of autistic people. And then conversely, there's a lot of autistic people who have intellectual disabilities, who have trouble graduating college. As a result, a lot of them wind up in sub-minimum wage labor. And that's a deliberate policy choice, because the only way you can pay someone below minimum wage labor, and I think a lot of people don't recognize this, is because there was a law that allows it, the Fair Labor Standards Act, that was passed in the 1930s, signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it has led to a lot of autistic people and a lot of disabled people as a whole being paid pennies on the dollar, pennies per hour, not even a dollar, but per hour, because that's seen as the compassionate thing to do. So I think the thing that I really wanted to do was show that these things exist for a reason. If autistic people wind up in a group home, that's because Medicaid is an entitlement if they are in a group home or if they're in a congregate setting. They waive their rights as an entitlement if they want to receive home and community-based services. That's a policy choice.
Yeah.
The reason why you saw a lot of autistic people get diagnosed in the 1990s and why there was this fear of an epidemic was because the Individual with Disabilities Education Act included autistic people in a way that its previous iterations under the Education for Handicapped Children Act didn't include. That's a policy choice. So I think that as a political journalist, it was a lot easier for me to look at things through a policy lens and say that we're here because of deliberate policies. And I think it's more important because these things don't happen on accident.
Yeah. And it was really interesting to see how those policies tied together and shaped the whole history, and also how different voices, like certain organizations and certain people who talk about autism and seem to provide like sort of the de facto opinions about autism, tend not to be autistic or disabled people, but are organizations that came in with a lot of influence and wealth, things like that.
I mean, I think let's talk about the big elephant in the room. Let's talk about Autism Speaks. I won't get you sued, but I think that, like, it's important to talk about, like, again, if we're going to talk about policy, let's talk about who can influence policy. It helps cause if there's a really wealthy benefactor who has a lot of political connections. And in the case of Autism Speaks, it was started by Bob Wright, the head of NBC Universal, who was incidentally the head of NBC Universal when Donald Trump was doing The Apprentice. And I read about that a little bit in the book. And his family could have influenced his ideas about autism, influenced Trump's ideas about autism, I should say. But like, I think that it's important to recognize that because he had those connections as a businessman, he had this kind of perfect intersection as head of NBC Universal, having connections within business and media and politics in a way I don't think any other person could have. And I combed through his memoir when I was writing this book. So like, I mean, I think that was really important for me to go through his memoir and read it. But I think it was important I think that it's important to recognize that a lot of times, even if you have the best intentions, it can lead to harmful ideas. And I think that is what sometimes has happened, or even not even necessarily harmful ideas, but just ideas or harmful policies, but ones that just don't affect autistic people in their daily lives. For a long time, Autism Speaks was focused on curing autistic people. They removed that language in 2016. Incidentally, when Trump was talked about it a year later, but like in 2017, he talked about curing autism or finding treatments for autism. But by then, Autism Speaks had already removed that language, but it shows how prevalent those ideas can be, how they can spread, and how political power, which I think is really important. I don't think you can talk about politics without talking about power and access to power and access to capital. And I think that was something that I wanted to do, is highlight how, and again, I want to highlight how power works and how power influenced how we talk about autism. And I should say that it would be easy, once again, to just blame Autism Speaks. And I think for a long time there was a focus on that. But I think it's important to recognize that there were organizations long before that that had bad ideas because they didn't include autistic people, whether it was Bruno Bettelheim or whether it was Bernard Rimland, or the early incarnations of what would later become the Autism Society of America, when it didn't include autistic voices for a long time. Now it kind of does, but it's important to remember that it was an outgrowth that for the longest time, the people who were considered the gatekeepers, both on when it came to knowledge, when it came to policy, when it came to money, we're often not autistic people. And I think that's really important, that the ways that I think it's really important, because I think as a journalist, I think about this a lot. I think about it regularly, that oftentimes it sounds almost contrarian or paradoxical, but oddly enough, journalists need to not know stuff to do our jobs. We need to say, what's going on? And why is this thing going on? And then what we need to rely on experts who can tell us things. I think for a long time, the people who were the experts were clinicians, nonprofit advocates, parent advocates, and as a result, but not really autistic people themselves. So as a result, that shaped media coverage for autistic people. That shaped how it was, because if these groups had capital, they had money, they had influence, they had research dollars, or they put out research studies and things like that, that gives them credibility. And I think it's really important to recognize how that influenced media coverage. And I'm a journalist, so I think about this a lot, but I think that was really important to talk about. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it's just not something that people are aware of or consciously think about. So it was really interesting to hear it framed in that way. And in addition, you also share a lot of your own stories and your life experiences in this book. So what was it like reflecting back on your own experiences as an autistic person and then sharing a lot of those experiences publicly in your book?
I didn't want this to be a memoir. I think that was really, I don't have anything against autistic people who've written memoirs. I think a lot of them can be very clarifying. I think that they were often an important corrective to the idea that autistic people couldn't speak for themselves for a long time. I don't want to come off as like I'm anti-memoir. I just think that it was, to me, the thing of it is that as an autistic person, I think the thing that I realized when I started writing, I think initially when I wanted to write this book, I think I might have wanted it to be more autobiographical. But then the thing that I realized was, I was like, but does this represent, is this indicative of other autistic people's experiences? And then I think what I did was that anytime that I thought about my own experiences, I would try to like corroborate and like interview other people or read other research. It's like, okay, this is a thing, or oh, this is just a me thing. I think also what it required is that it required me being brutally honest with if I'm going to be a journalist and I'm going to treat this as a journalistic venture, I think this is one of the difficulties of the memoirs, that memoirs, you tend to put yourself in the best light because you want to, but and because our memory, we're biased toward looking at ourselves in the best light. But I think one of the things I really wanted to do, that I really tried to do, was was I really tried to be as honest with myself as possible. And also, like, there are times where, like, I think as I got older, I realized, oh, that was something where maybe I was in the wrong, or oh, that was something where maybe I wasn't as generous to myself, or oh, now that I know more about autism, like that might have been a thing that I didn't think was a thing. So in some ways, I was more generous to myself. In some ways, I was much more critical of myself. And I don't think that I could have written as good of a book if I hadn't been both those things to myself, been more charitable myself, and I think also contextualize those experiences within a larger autism experience. And I think that was in and of itself really important. And I think the reason why anytime that and I think one of the things that I always wanted to do when I included anything autobiographical is I didn't want it to be about me as much as I wanted to use it as a launching off point to make a larger point. So that if there was something that I experienced that a lot of autistic people experience writ large, I wanted to use that as a starting point to discuss something. But if my experiences were an outlier or unique to me, I think it was important for me to say, this was unique to me, but that's not the case for a lot of other autistic people. And then for everything in between, I tried to do, a little bit of both. But I think that was really if I was going to do anything autobiographical, I think I always wanted to contextualize it.
Yeah. And I think that's great because you really weave in a lot of, personal stories and experiences of people, not just of yourself, but the other people that you went out and interviewed and sort of put it in the context as real examples of what this policy looks like, how this history came about and what's going on in society, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that again, that was one of those things where I felt like, okay, if I can't, if I am a boring cisgender heterosexual male, but I know that there are plenty of autistic people who have been excluded from the conversation about autism. There are a lot of women who've been excluded. As a Latino male, I know a lot of people of color have been excluded. I know a lot of Asian Americans and a lot of Black people and a lot of Latinos and a lot of people who English is a second language have been excluded. A lot of people who are from immigrant families, even if they speak English as their first language. In the same way, I know a lot of people within the LGBTQ community have been excluded. And I think it was really important. I think if there was one kind of thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to say that our experiences and our kind of framing of autism has left a lot of people out of the frame. So what I've wanted to do is that I've wanted to grow that frame out to show the fuller tapestry. So like, I mean, if you look at your window, you're only going to see a little bit of what's going on in your neighborhood, only so much of what. So I think what I wanted to do is I wanted to get a bigger window so that you could see more of what is in the frame and include more things in the frame of the window that you otherwise haven't seen. So I think that was a really important thing.
Yeah. And one thing I thought was really powerful is that you also interview several non-speaking autistic people in the book. What was that process like to have
that was really interesting because that required a lot of I had to change a lot of my attitudes about non-speaking autistic people. For a long time, I thought that they should be cured, and I thought that it might be the right thing for them to be. But then later on, I realized that maybe that's my own bias speaking. So that was something that was a bias I had to overcome. I think the other thing that is interesting is that I think that as journalists, we tend to be really skeptical of when we had to email questions for people. Because that prevents extemporaneous conversation. We feel that prevents people from being candid. That prevents people from, we don't like a canned kind of statement. But I think that my feeling was if I was going to include non-speaking autistic people, I had to get over it. And I had to just, realize that that's the only way you're going to include non-speaking autistic people. And mind you, I should say that some autistic people who I spoke to, they would send me emails afterward and saying, this is the context for what they did, because a lot of times they would, because I know that it takes a lot of time to process things, they would take a lot of time for them to process things. They would say, this is the important context, and they realize that. And usually after I've interviewed someone, particularly someone in power or a member of Congress, things like that, I'm like, no, screw you, our interview's over, you're doing this to make yourself look better.
Oh.
Whereas I think it was really important, conversely, that recognizing that a lot of times autistic people, the process of being interviewed is such a sensory, overwhelming experience that it's important to recognize that some people, it might behoove them to give them that chance to later contextualize things or to include their thoughts after we had that kind of interview. Because I think I always kind of worry that, like, if you get these questions, because like the interview is a very sacred setting for me.
Mhm.
It's a chance where after you've built enough trust and after you've built the right context, you had this setting where you and the interviewee are on equal footing, and it's a really important thing. I don't, tamper with quotes. That's just not something I do.
Mhm.
Like to me, it's sacred. It is like, it's like the red words in the Bible. Like you just like they're that sacred, and you shouldn't tamper with them. And that required me getting over some of my own biases and my own hangups about that. So that took work on my end too. And I think that it's really important to recognize. I think I really want to say is that this was as much a learning experience for me, and I had to grow and I had to change through writing this book. I don't come at this as someone who was an authority, from the head of Zeus.
Mhm.
I didn't come out fully formed. I had to learn, and I had to shed my own biases that I had. And I had to shed my own preconceived notions. I had to do this. This was as much an experience that changed me as much as I hope to change people's minds.
Mhm.
So I think one of the things that I really insist on people, and I say, because a lot of my friends, a lot of my neurotypical friends, they say, they've asked me, and like people who I care about have said, like, I would never want to disrespect autistic people or disabled people, or like, what's the right thing, or I'm worried that I'm going to get this wrong. And I think what I say is like, look, you're going to get stuff wrong.
Mhm.
You are going to say the wrong thing. You are going to offend someone. You are going to slip up, because this is a really complicated thing. This is a thing that we've not been conditioned to understand autism or disability. So it requires a complete rewiring of how you see the human body and the human mind. So inevitably, if you've gone 20, 30 years, I'm 31. So if you've gone 30 years without thinking about that, you're inevitably going to mess up.
Mhm.
So what I want to say to people is that, like, it took me a lot of learning and unlearning. And I wrote a whole book about it. So give yourself that charity. Also, I think that the disability community and autistic people as a whole will recognize that when you make mistakes, if you come at it sincerely, and if you listen when autistic people or disabled people say, look, that's not the right way to say this is not the right thing to do, or this is actually a bad idea, or maybe you can listen to us more, things like that, that you come at it, you take that criticism, and you try to learn from it, and you try to grow from it. You don't push back on it. That, I think, is the better way to go about it than worrying that you're going to say something wrong ever, because you're going to say something wrong.
Mhm.
I said a lot of the wrong things, and I think some of that cost me a few interviews, which is to say that, like, people had read my past work and they didn't like what I had written. And these are people who I wanted to interview, who I thought they were the right people to interview, but they were like, "No, you said these things in the past, and I'm not interested." That's well within their right.
Yeah.
You know, I messed up, and that cost me. But I think in the same respect, there are two ways to go. Is like say, "Oh well, they didn't understand what I was trying to do. Screw them,"
Mm.
or I could say, "Yeah, that sucks. I messed up, but I can do better. I want to do better." How can I do better? And one of the things when this book came out, what happened is Jay Adedin, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He reviewed my book for the Boston Globe,
Mhm.
and he said that I got some things. I didn't word some things correctly when writing about the LGBTQ plus community.
Mhm.
And that was really like, and I remember thinking, oh man, that sucks, because I worked hard. I wanted to include LGBTQ plus people
Yeah.
in my book and include their voices and things like that. And I was like, man, that really sucks, because I worked really hard at that.
Yeah.
But, I also recognize that that's not my community. And I had to recognize that, like, Jay is from that community. And just like how I want, typical people to understand what autistic people have to say, I had to take that as I have to take that and I have to say, what can I do different? I had to sit with that. And I messaged him after and I said, look, I loved your review. I thought you got it right. And I actually agree with your criticisms. And then and I said, I want to do better.
Yeah.
And hopefully I do better. And hopefully I can be mature enough to say, yeah, no, like when people ask me about that, if anybody in the LGBTQ plus community ever asks me about it, I hope I could say, my response, and they say like, you got some things wrong. I could say, yeah, I got some stuff wrong. Yeah. Like that was my mistake. I'm sorry, but rather than saying, don't you see how much I was trying to do stuff for you? Didn't you see what, rather I could say, look, I was trying to do something right. I messed up, but I want to do right. And hopefully, like, as a journalist can help me do better, so, because I want to do better.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like it's part of that whole wider conversation about even allyship, which has just come really to the forefront in the past few years, is that allies are scared to get things wrong, but it's like, no, you will get things wrong, probably multiple times. It's a learning process.
Yeah.
It takes a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. What was interesting was midway through writing this book, one of the people who I interviewed at length came out as non-binary.
Mm-hmm.
And like what was interesting was that I cited their book when they were still presenting as, their assigned gender.
Mm-hmm.
I remember thinking to myself, and then like I was thinking, so like what I did is I was just like, okay, what do I do? We'd already conducted our interview. So like I said, like, so what did I do? I just emailed. I was just like, what do I do? Because when we spoke, you were going by your old name, your dead name, and then like, I cite your book, and I was like, what do I do with endnotes? They're like, okay, they're like, just use my name now, and they were like, and then we worked out a system that I was just like, okay, okay, but like it was one of those things where it was just like, I knew that was going to be like that was just like. It was like, oh, this is this is not something because I just didn't know a lot of non-binary people before that. So like, I was just like, okay, how do I go about this? And how do I do it in a way? Because I want to, cite their book, give them the credit, but also, not misnamed, and then also like, how do I give that proper context and things like that? So I think that's one of those things that inevitably you're going to, got things wrong in the process, but then like, I would have rather have gotten things wrong in the researching and in the learning phase than to have had the book on shelves and realize I got something wrong.
Yeah.
I'm more than willing to sacrifice a little bit of my dignity if it means getting something right.
Yeah. And sometimes the easiest way to address that is to just ask the person, especially if it's
absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like if you're ever in doubt, you should probably just ask someone.
Yeah. Like even, I'm still learning a lot about autism. Like I was just diagnosed a couple of months ago, but I've maybe been trying to study and be part of the community online for about a year. And even the basic things that seem like they should be basic, like identity first language versus person first language. Like I still talk to autistic, but I talk to autistic people who use person first language about themselves, but if that's what they want to do, it's their individual choice. But then I don't know. It gets
like one of the things I noticed was that like a lot of autistic or people who are autistic, people with autism who are older, who like are not from my generation, who are from Gen X or who are boomers, prefer person first language.
Mm-hmm.
They prefer being called a person with autism, whereas a lot of millennials and Gen Z prefer, they say, no, this is part of my identity. And that was one of those things where it's like, that might just be an age divide thing. That might be a contextual thing. And it's like, okay, you got to just, listen, you got to you have to take people seriously, take them seriously and literally,
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I mean, I just feel like there's so much misleading information sort of out there about autism for some of the things that we talked about earlier about who's got the influence and got the microphone half the time. The people with the biggest platforms don't usually have the greatest information. So besides reading your book,
they don't oftentimes have the best intention.
Exactly. Yeah, there's that too as well. So yeah, I mean, But besides reading your book, obviously everyone should go and read your book. How can the public get accurate and trustworthy information about autism? Like, where should they go to?
I think that there's a lot of really important things out there. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is a really important organization. Groups like, websites like the Thinking Person's Guide to Autism is fabulous. Books like Sincerely Your Autistic Child, which is a book that I'm reading right now. It's put together by the Autism Women and Non-Binary Network. It's a fantastic book that really is kind of a good introduction to this stuff. I think that, but then also I think, weirdly enough, as much of a cesspool as it is, social media has been fantastic for autistic people in some ways, because I think for non-speaking autistic people was the first way that it's really in some ways the first time that people can take them seriously and take them literally, because they're able to, because it's a type-based medium.
Right.
Things like Twitter and Facebook can be good. They can also be terrible. Like something like TikTok can be really bad for autistic people, but it can also be great.
Right.
Hashtags like Actually Autistic or hashtag Asking Autistics are fantastic. Like if you want to ask autistic people a question, like ask at the hashtag Asking Autistics is fantastic. I used it regularly. If you're new to the community, you're new to being autistic, using like hashtag Actually Autistic is really helpful. So, there are ways and there are means of doing it. And I think it's constantly seeking out those voices, and it's always seeking out. It requires work. I'm not going to lie. It requires work, because I think that the people with the biggest microphones, they get priority when you search stuff on Google and when you search stuff on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. So like it requires a little bit more work, but it's also much more rewarding. It's the equivalent of making homemade chocolate chip cookies versus buying something at the grocery store. So
yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And social media has just been a great place to, as you said, to learn and hear directly from autistic people who for so long really didn't have an easy way to, not just voice themselves publicly, but to organize into groups. And I feel like with the rise of social media, so many people I talk to who were younger than, even people who are younger than me, talk about not really like feeling like they were the only one going through what they had, like feel like the only autistic person, the only person, with Tourette syndrome, until they realize, oh no, there's actually tons of other people. There's no other way for social to get together.
Yeah, because I think that what happened is that like if you are in Nebraska and you're autistic, and it takes a long time, and I say this because I have a friend who her daughter lives in Nebraska and they're autistic. If you live in a rural area and there just isn't a lot of rural healthcare, and there isn't a rural hospital, there isn't a lot of psychiatric care in the area that you're living in. It might be really hard to see other disabled people, other people with disabilities, or other autistic people in your community. And then, conversely, if you are, but like being in social media, you can, and Twitter or TikTok or something like that, somebody in Nebraska can connect with somebody who lives in Queens. The fact that you and I are talking over Zoom is proof positive of that. So like on one end, it can be just toxic, because it allows people with really bad intentions to, have the same footing as people like yourself and myself. On the other end, it elevates voices of autistic people in a way that I don't think they otherwise would have been elevated. I think a perfect example of that is you've seen it just this past week when, after Rochelle Walensky, the CDC director, said, a lot of the deaths of people with COVID and Omicron are people who had, 4 or more comorbidities beforehand. I don't think that the pushback, tomorrow she's going to be meeting with the AAPD, the Association of Americans with People with Disabilities. I don't think it would have, weirdly enough, A, because of the pandemic, but B, if it was just people protesting in front of the CDC in Atlanta, I don't think it would have had the same kind of effect. But because you had people all over the country, and by virtue of, because of disability rights movement, because not everybody can take a flight, some of them, their wheelchairs might get destroyed if they take a flight, or some people can't, make the trek or the commute down. But you have these people from, it was started, the hashtags that were used were started by someone in Pittsburgh, and Melanie Barbara, and it was something that was used by people in Washington and in the DMV area, and it was used by people in California and things like that. It created this critical mass that I don't think even a street protest in front of the CDC headquarters in Atlanta would have had. So.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It really brings a lot of attention, and it's also a sustained attention. So a protest is just
Yeah,
there for a couple
absolutely.
hours. This is like weeks and days and weeks. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think another example of that is, last year when Sia put out her dumpster fire of a movie music, I don't think if a bunch of autistic people went in front of a studio in Hollywood, I think oddly enough, because it was going on during the pandemic, it was released like before there was a vaccine and things like that. Like
Yeah.
you had a lot of autistic people who were just in their homes
Mhm.
and they saw this just like garbage movie was coming out. It created that sustained attention and it created that kind of momentum and snowball effect that in a way it became something that Hollywood couldn't ignore because it was being pushed on Twitter so much, it was being pushed on TikTok so much, to the extent that Sia deleted her Twitter account. So
Mhm.
I think that was really, like I always say, that it was like, in the beginning of 2021, two obnoxious people who insulted people on Twitter are no longer on Twitter. One of them was, a celebrity who had too much of a high of an opinion of themselves, and the other one was the president of the United States. Uh, uh, that wouldn't have existed otherwise, I don't think, because I think the pushback was so strong and it was so sustained and it was so consistent that when you got to the extent that when even Tina Fey made fun of it at the Golden Globes last year,
Mhm.
that was like, on one hand, yeah, it was funny, but it was also like, in a weird way, it was like, I remember thinking to myself, like, we won.
Yeah.
It's like autistic people won because otherwise that movie was nominated for a Golden Globe.
Mhm.
But if it hadn't been for that sustained pushback, it probably could have won, It
Yeah.
probably could have gotten, but it was because autistic people said this movie is trash
Mhm.
that it shaped the conversation. I think that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. So, yeah, at the beginning of the interview, you were talking about, when you were just starting out and starting to write about autism and how originally you didn't really want to be like the autism journalist, but
No,
essentially you write about plenty of other things, obviously, but you are like a key source and of working on a lot of those stories. So how has that been now that's been a couple years since you've been researching the book and now the book's out? How does
it's
it feel to be?
on one end, it's great. I think it's cool that this is something that I have a lot of authority on, and it's something that and it's something I care about deeply. It's not something I can always do stuff for. Because I have a day job, but it's one of those things that I can do. I'm on top of my job at the Independent. I'm a columnist at MSNBC, so I'm able to write about that, for my regular column for MSNBC. So that's one thing. But I think the other thing that's great is that you're seeing more autistic journalists as a whole. I think when I was starting out, it was like me and Sarah covering this stuff, and now there's people like Zach Budrick covering it. There's Emily Watkins, I believe that's her name, and who lives in New England. There's a lot of other autistic people who are working in media that otherwise weren't working in media at the time when I was starting. And so it's one of those things where it's no longer just me, Sarah Luderman, and Dylan Matthews over at Vox. There's multiple people. And that is, there's Brady Gerber, who writes for Vulture a lot. Writes about pop culture. So it's great in a lot of ways that we have a more sustained and more spread out kind of media reporters, because then that means that there's no longer this burden for one person or two people to shoulder. I was on NPR last year. I was on One Egg with Sarah Luderman, and it was great because it was there was one host. There's the host of One A, and then there was Steve Silverman, who was neurotypical, and then there's Sarah and I. And we were all on equal footing. Obviously the host has a little bit more power, but but that in and of itself is great because it's there's now more people doing more stuff, and it no longer falls on one person anymore.
Mhm. That's great. And it's
Two
always,
people anymore. Whatever.
yeah. And it's always great to see autistic people just represented in different parts
Yeah.
of careers. It's not all just STEM. Honestly, so many of my friends and people I talk to who are autistic are also writers and creatives and artists. And it's I kind of forgot about the whole STEM stereotype because all my
Yeah, a
friends are
lot of my
creative.
friends who are autistic are not. Most of my friends who are autistic are not in STEM. They're
Yeah.
painters, or they're lawyers, or they're lobbyists,
Right.
or that's partially just because I live in Washington,
Yeah.
and a lot of the autistic people I know, like a lot of other people, surprise, work in politics or advocacy or nonprofit work or whatever.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of autistic people, across the country who are grad students studying, who work in English and communication, or they are, a lot of students when I went to Marshall University, they were studying like who are autistic are studying like environmental science, like, and that's great too. It's like, it's not just computer coders. It's people who like live in Appalachia and want to improve their region. I think the example of like someone who like Greta Thunberg, she's not doing disability advocacy. She's doing environmental advocacy. And that she talks about how being autistic is a driver of her advocacy, but it's not the thing that she's advocating for. It's not, it's part of her identity. It's a driver of her identity, but it's not the thing that she's advocating for. And it shows how autistic people can contribute to other sectors. So that in and of itself, my friend Zach Widrick, he works at The Hill. He writes about energy policy. He doesn't really write about disability policy that much, but, so that's important, like having other people in different sectors. So that all those things are important. So,
Absolutely. Well, that's absolutely awesome. So yeah, Eric, thank you so much for being on my show. Where can people get your book, We're Not Broken? Where should they go to get that?
We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation. You can get it wherever fine books are sold. You can get it so that means you could buy it at your local bookshop. If not, you can always ask for it. You could get it at your library. That's all. You can request it at your library for it to be there. You can also get it on bookshop.org. You can get it on IndieBound. You can buy it directly from HarperCollins, which is my publisher. You can buy it on Amazon, though I really wouldn't like it if you got it on Amazon, but I understand if you like Amazon. You can get it. You can get it through Barnes & Noble, Target, wherever you buy your books. You can order it online. And if I really appreciate you welcoming me on the show. I really appreciate talking with you about this, and I hope people after this go out and buy the book, and if they have any questions, ask me. So
yes, wonderful.
That's how I wound up on this. You asked me if you wanted to be on the podcast, and I was like, okay, cool.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. I really enjoyed talking with you, Eric, and absolutely enjoyed the book. And yeah, everybody go out, buy We're Not Broken. It's just a really great way to get introduced to the whole conversation about autism and yeah, really expand your mind. I learned so much from it, and I know that all my listeners will too. So yeah, thanks again, Eric. Really enjoyed talking to you today.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah.